where's my Pashmina shorts?
I have an announcement to make.
I asked you for getting that from Khan Market. What? Oh, okay.
Actually, first, an apology for not making this announcement sooner, and also for what happened at the wedding. I'm so sorry. And for sneaking out to AvengerCon. Yeah, no, okay. Okay. I am the light girl.
You're what?
Nightlight.
Oh my God! I had no idea.
Oh, Toba.
You told them already.
But Kamala, I only told Abu. Really?
What are you
In
implying?
classic Khan gossip train, you tell Ummi, she tells Abu, and we over here because he always has his phone on speaker.
Welcome to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine. Welcoming back another returning guest, and that is Dr. Sai Islam. Sai, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. Happy to be back.
Happy to have you back. This is your third time you're on here now, and we're going to be talking about another one of the MCU TV shows. But before we get into that, a few other things to talk about. First, why don't you give people just a little bit of a brief refresher about who you are and what you do and all that stuff?
Sure. So I am an associate professor of industrial organizational psychology at Farmingdale State College, and also vice president of consulting with Talent Metrics Consulting. All of that basically means that I research and study the psychology of work and have a lot of fun thinking about work. And I'm also the co-author of a book about leadership in the Marvel Cinematic Universe called Leaders Assemble, Leadership in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. My co-author, Gordon Schmidt, appeared, and I appeared on an earlier episode where we talked about Iron Man 3.
Mm-hmm.
I was in the minority in loving Iron Man 3. So
you were kind of in the minority, but Gordon agreed with you, I think, more than he disagreed with you. And I was, and you guys, and I no longer hated that movie. So I don't love it. It's still probably my least favorite of the MCU movies, but I found different things to appreciate it after talking to you guys about it.
All right. Well, that's good. So hopefully everybody gets to watch the movie again and listen to the episode, and maybe they'll appreciate Iron Man 3 a little bit more.
Yeah. Another thing I've been doing lately on the show is I've been asking guests kind of what sort of thing are they kind of interested in now? What's kind of grabbing their attention, grabbing their interest? Can be movies, can be comics, TV, movies, video games, books, whatever. What is kind of like the thing you're interested in right now?
So there are a couple of things that I'm watching. Number one is a show that's on FX called Reservation Dogs. I don't know if anybody's seen that yet. If you have seen it, it's a really cool show. It's about a Native American community in Oklahoma, primarily about a group of kind of lost Native American teens, but it's really cool in terms of seeing reservation life in sort of a different light. It's very funny, but it's also really dramatic, and so that's been a really great show. It's very, very good. It's like it's up there with What We Do in the Shadows in terms of being like one of my favorite shows on right now.
Okay, cool. I haven't even heard of that show, so that's interesting.
Yeah, so it's only on its second season. Seasons are pretty short. Probably altogether it'll be like 20 episodes. And totally worth it to watch. It gives you like a lot of insight into Native American life in the United States, and kind of like gives you a different perspective on that, because I grew up watching a lot of like westerns and having that image of Native Americans, and this is like a total totally different. If you like the writing of Sherman Alexie, I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He's a Native American writer.
Oh, right. Yeah.
He did, he wrote I want to say he wrote a book called Holy Smoke. And it's very good. It's very similar in style to that. I think, just kind of slice of life stories with kind of funny, or in some cases poignant angle to it.
Yeah, I feel like I know his name. I feel like I've read one of his books before. I'm just looking up real quick. So he sorry, I'm just checking out real quick here. I think it was like an anthology of his. No, actually I haven't, but I think I've so he did. Oh wait, yeah, The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fist Fight in Heaven. That was the one I read.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, I haven't read that. I've read mostly like his short stories.
Yeah, that's actually that's a collection of short stories.
Maybe, you know, I'm getting old, so maybe I have read it and I can't remember, but definitely like worth checking out. You know, and then the other show that my wife and I have been watching on Hulu is called The Patient. It stars Steve Carell and Domhnall Gleeson. Domhnall Gleeson plays a serial killer that's trying to stop being a serial killer, so he kidnaps his therapist.
Oh,
It's obviously the best way to solve your serial killing urges. So that's been pretty interesting.
We were just talking about literally just before you got on. Recorded the last episode with Mark Buskett talking about Batman Forever, and that has, you know, a psychiatrist trying to cure a patient by fucking him. So that's
also not a good therapy technique.
Also not a good therapy technique. Yeah, I think the AMA might have some questions about that.
Yeah, we gotta make sure that we don't doctor-patient confidentiality and no touching, right?
Yeah. So because I just finished getting up, I don't really have anything new I'm into, but I will say again, just because it's worth repeating, that I just finished watching the third episode of The U.S. and the Holocaust, the new Ken Burns documentary.
Oh,
and
wow.
That is really good. It's all about the U.S. reaction to the Holocaust and like how the U.S. was treating Jewish refugees at the time, how people in the U.S. were reacting and responding to the Holocaust, how the State Department actually did a lot to deny it was happening at the time. There's a lot of really interesting stuff in there. Like even I've done a bit of research around that period, so I'd known a lot more stuff than we're taught in school going in. But even still, I found a lot of things in that documentary that I didn't know before. It's definitely worth a watch. It's on the PBS app, so check it out.
Wow, that's a great recommendation. So I'll probably check that out.
And it's also kind of terrifying because you see how many of those same types of things are happening now. So there's a lot of terrifying parallels there, especially because we're recording this now in mid-September, and there's the whole stuff going on with DeSantis and the border, Trump and QAnon and all that kind of stuff. And you see a lot of that stuff was happening back then in America too.
Yeah. And you know, you're starting to see some of that also in India now with the current right-wing party, the way they're kind of framing, you know, what it means to be Indian and what it means to be not Indian. There's a lot of accusations around, you know, just mobs of people, you know, hunting down, Indian Muslims and bulldozing mosques. And it's also things that discourse is actually coming to the States. So I grew up in a town called Edison, where there's a lot of South Asians, and there are some Indians living in Edison that wanted it as part of their India Day parade. They wanted to have a bulldozer to kind of symbolize what's happening in India as like that they support bulldozing people's homes if they're not Hindu. So it's very, very interesting to kind of see that in this context now.
Did you ever see Hassan Minhaj had a Netflix show for a brief time, Patriot Act?
I did see that. Yep.
I remember one of the most powerful episodes he did was one about this very topic, about like Modi in India and all the rising kind of ethno-nationalism and all that kind of stuff happening. And and that show was on like 4 years ago or something. And and this stuff is still happening and it's getting worse. So I hope that's an episode that I hope I could say like, oh, well, that was an interesting artifact in time. And thank God that's not happening anymore, but it's not quite the case. Yeah. And that connects to this one. It also reminded me that another thing that I've been doing lately is, have you heard about the Partition podcast?
No, so I've not heard about the Partition podcast.
This is it's a podcast that's all about like the partition between India and separating India into Pakistan, and it's by like it's being hosted by I think she's second or third generation Pakistani American journalist, and it's really interesting. And she's had a few episodes out so far, and it definitely ties into what we're going to be talking about today.
Okay, I will definitely check that out because I know a little bit about partition, partly from like family history or reading on my own, but to have a podcast to follow along with would be helpful. And then it's funny, this actually ties very, very nicely into what we're going to talk about with Ms. Marvel.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know,
Okay, so yeah, like you said, today we're going to be talking about Ms. Marvel. And before we jump into the show, what's your experience with this character? Have you ever read of her in the comics before? Have you read any of her appearances in the larger Marvel universe? Because I know you are a comics guy like me. So
Yeah. So I loved this character. I remember hearing about her. I want to say 2012, 2013, whenever they made the announcement that, Ms. Marvel was going to be, a Pakistani American teenager from New Jersey. And I was like, how did that even happen? And if I remember correctly, the reason they brought the character back was they were worried about losing the license or worried about being able to, being able to continue to publish the character. And so I'm a big fan of G. Willow Wilson. I've read a couple of her novels. They're very good. I've liked a lot of her comics writing. I think she's really one of the one of the top tier writers in comics right now. And I was like, oh, this is cool. I really want to check this out. And I started by picking up like the TPBs once they started coming out. I'm kind of out of the floppy buying game, which is not great, but I just don't have enough space in the house, and B, just want to read like complete stories or semi-complete stories.
Same here.
Yeah. So and so the character for me, I loved the comic book. I've really liked a lot of her other appearances, even in Champions. And I liked her, I haven't read all of Saladin Ahmed's run, but I'm a big fan of his writing as well. Both of his comics work, and he wrote a great novel that I think is really really phenomenal. And so I really like the character. The character holds an enormous amount of personal meaning for me, because it's like such a weird, it's honestly a thing that I never thought I'd saw. Now this isn't to say there haven't been other comic book characters that have been Muslim or Indian, but some of them have had these kind of problematic elements to them. So a famous example is Dust. Grant Morrison created her for X-Men, and she has these sand powers. She wears a burqa or in a veil. And so it's I mean, I was okay with that character, but the representation that you see with Ms. Marvel is something that's really close to something that I can really recognize, because I'm a guy that grew up in New Jersey and is Muslim. I'm not Pakistani. My family's from Bangladesh, but we'll talk a little bit about some of the differences later. But there's definitely a strong connection for me with this character, and really that character kept me reading comics. Even while I was working as a professor early on, going on the tenure track, you just don't have a ton of time to read comics. But I was, keeping up with this character because it was so interesting and powerful. And then my wife, who is not a comic book person at all, absolutely loves the character. She just loves the fact that there's a kind of a South Asian character that she can relate to and she can see. And my son, he's 2 now, he loves the we got the Ms. Marvel Golden book for him, and he loves reading it. He actually really enjoys the trailer to Ms. Marvel. Okay. So he loves watching the trailer. He loves the music, and he kind of I don't know how much he fully understands, but he recognizes things in the show that he's seen in his own life, where he's like, oh, this, her mom looks like his grandmother, and he's kind of like, oh, this is exciting. So yeah, there's a really cool kind of deep connection to the character. I do like some of the other characters that are Muslim that are out there, that I think Jeff Johns has created a couple. Simon Baz. I like Amulet, who shows up in later Ms. Marvel comics in the Saladin Ahmed run. But I think that the other cool thing about Ms. Marvel is that started a whole set of really interesting different types of characters. I think Amadeus Cho also debuted around the same time.
I think he was a few years earlier, if I'm not mistaken, because I think he came about, actually, I think it may have been 10 years earlier, actually.
Really? That much?
I think so, yeah, because he was already there, I believe. I think he came in Greg Pak's Hulk run, which was
oh yeah, that would be
Civil War, pre-Civil War, around that time.
Oh, that is interesting. That's a good question. When he debuts, let's see. Oh yeah, you're right. 2005.
Oh,
So
2005.
yeah,
Okay,
almost
yeah.
10
So
years,
yeah,
almost 10 years before. Okay. That's true. Okay. Yeah. So I do think that there's this push for, characters of different backgrounds,
Mhm.
and I think there's something really valuable in that, and it deepens the stories and it makes the stories more interesting and fun. At least for me. I think it makes it, a lot cooler to kind of like read those sort of stories, especially because we know that there's going to be superpowered people from
Mhm.
all sorts of different places. There's even, I don't know if you read this comic, but there's actually a Spider-Man India.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Uh,
I haven't read it, but I've heard of it, and of course he popped up in the Spider-Verse stories, and he was I'm pretty sure he was a regular member of the Web Warriors, which kind of spun out of that. No pun
yeah.
intended.
Yeah. Yeah, so that, I mean, that's been fun. Like that's so cool to have those types of characters kind of pop up, um and I think that's what makes the comic really really interesting, really fun. I actually reread the comics again, like at least the G. Willow Wilson run,
Mhm.
and it's very it's fun to look at it and see how much of it is like inspired a little bit by Buffy. It's very like high school
Mhm.
oriented. I recently reread the first, like, I don't know, I want to say 75 issues of like Amazing Spider-Man, which is what we think of as the prototypical like high school character, but he's only in high school for a little bit in those early issues. He's only
Right.
in high school for like the first year or two.
Mhm.
But Ms. Marvel, for the majority of her run, she's been in high school dealing with like that high school superhero life, and that also very much plays into the kind of Peter Parker elements
Mhm.
of the character that I really enjoy.
Yeah, I had a few things I wanted to touch on there. First, did want to touch on the Muslim characters aspect, and I do remember the Dust, and I just recently wrapped up a podcast with two other guys. We had done a reread of the Morrison run, and when we were looking back on the Dust issue, there was this kind of sense of like, okay, yeah, this is an attempt, but at the same time, why does the Arabic character have to turn into sand? It seems a little bit on the nose.
I appreciate the effort,
but there was a lot of that with like even with a lot of POC characters. There's like we have to make their powers tied to their identity in some way, and sometimes a very blatant way. Like Sunfire is a Japanese guy who has the power of nuclear fire, which I'm like, it's a little bit odd. Or Silver Samurai can channel his power through his samurai sword. And there's a lot of that kind of stuff in a lot of these characters. And one of the things I think that is nice about Ms. Marvel is that they find a way to make her identity tied into like psychological aspects of her powers, which is why in the comics when she transforms herself into Carol Danvers' Ms. Marvel look. And there is that whole psychological aspect of it, which is really interesting that I didn't realize when I had read the comics, but other people have pointed out to me, and it becomes a lot more. It adds a whole nother layer to that. But other than that, like her powers are just shape shifting. It's nothing that is tied to her being Pakistani or tied to her being Muslim. It's just like with white characters, right? There's nothing inherently white about the fact that Cyclops shoots laser beams out of his eyes.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting. The body morphing thing also has another element that I talked about with my wife a little bit, which is girls going through puberty,
right.
They go through enormous changes in their body, and there is that element to it as well. There's all these moments in the early Ms. Marvel comics where she feels like I can't control my body, right? I don't know what's happening to it, and I feel like that's something that young women can relate to in some cases, where they they're going through all these experiences, these hormonal changes, same similar what boys go through, but I think that sense of my body's no longer under my control, or I'm not sure what I'm capable of, what I'm able to do. I think that's also a big part of it. In terms of her powers, I always found the stretching powers and the big beginning powers to be kind of interesting, and they have a very weird and deep explanation for why she can like expand mass in one of the later issues. Turns out that she's like borrowing mass from herself in the future.
Oh, okay.
There's a whole I can't remember the exact details of the explanation, but Bruno in the comics does some tests and is able to figure out why she's able to embiggen, because in theory, scientifically, you're not able to just add mass to your body, right? That's like impossible. So he was trying to figure out, like, wait a minute, why can she embiggen? Why can she get smaller? What's happening? And there was like a weird time travel explanation for why that was, that she was actually borrowing like mass from herself, from a future version of herself, to make that happen.
Makes you wonder how that works with other stretchy type characters too. Like, so.
What is it? Unstable molecules. That's
Unstable
the answer.
molecules. Yeah. It's comic book science.
Yeah.
But yeah, I remember when that comic was announced, and I remember there being like this kind of backlash to it, just like and I for the life of me, I still cannot understand that. I mean, me being I'm a cis straight white guy. I've seen characters like myself. I've got no shortage of characters that look like me. It's not gonna infringe on me at all if there are other characters who don't look like me. It's not a big deal. So I have never understood that kind of backlash. That even to this day, we're seeing it now. Right now we're in the midst of this, racist backlash over the fact that there's a black girl playing Little Mermaid.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because we're starting to see this with Marvel stuff too. Because you see comments like this about She-Hulk. She-Hulk was a character that's been around almost 40 years, right? At least 40 years. And people are like, well, why do they make Hulk a girl? There's like some woke nonsense. And I'm like, but this character has been around. There's no shortage of characters that are, that are introduced in a variety of ways that, that allow for some type of diversity, so you have different types of characters in the same kind of legacy. You see that a little bit in DC where they're I can't remember if Wally West is he's black in some later editions.
Yeah, the new 52 version of Wally West was black, and he's still around. I think he goes by Wallace West, though. I think now that they brought the original Wally back, but so they've got them both running around. I think the black Wally West, I think, is running around with the Titans as Kid Flash, and then you got the white Wally West. I think he's like, I'm not sure what's going on with him right now. I think he's another Flash right now. I'm not up to date on the Flash books right now.
I just assume that all the Flashes are running somewhere.
Yeah,
no matter what the timeline is, that they're around. But that was an okay change, because there's no reason for there's nothing necessary for Flash to be necessarily be white, right? And I just kind of dig the fact that we can have these sorts of characters popping up. I mean, if we get to the point where we have Wolverine's daughter, like X-23, show up in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I can't wait to see some of the reactions that people have about that, because these are established kind of canon characters that are just now being introduced into the movie universe and the TV universe, because they're already there. So there's like just this catalog. I don't know if there was some complaints. I remember when Hawkeye came out about Kate Bishop and Haley Steinfeld kind of playing the character that they but I don't think people have strong feelings about Hawkeye the way that they do about Iron Man. We're starting to see some complaints already about Ironheart coming in and being introduced in Wakanda Forever, like and it doesn't do anything to harm the legacy of those characters. It just makes these other new characters that are lots of fun. I will plug, I like the Ironheart comic book quite a bit. I thought that was really, really good. So there are a lot of really cool stories that are popping up, and it's nice to see them get translated into this other medium, so that other people can really get a chance to be exposed to them, and hopefully go back to the comics and start reading them again, because I'm like a comics first guy, right? Like I'm not as like, if I see a bad adaptation, I'm like, that's not great. But I don't get that upset about it, as long as the comics are still there and as long as we still have that original source material.
Yeah. Also, on the topic of Muslim characters too, I'm not sure if you've ever read Christopher Priest did the Crew limited series back in the early 2000s. I think it was early 2000s. And as much as I love Sam Wilson as Falcon, I do think it's really cool to see because in that you had the son of Isaiah Bradley, Josiah, who had gone through like the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights movement and is kept young by the super soldier serum, and he ends up converting to Islam later on in life. And so you've got this Black Captain America who's also a Muslim, and it was an ensemble book, so there wasn't a whole lot of time Priest could develop. But just in like there's one issue where it's like all about Josiah's story and all about like the idea of what's it like to be a Black man in America, what's it like to be a Muslim man in America. And one of his the people at his mosque, they even say to him, it's like, that flag doesn't stand for us, you know, why are you waving that flag? And he's got that Captain America legacy, which based on the Truth miniseries is also this legacy of, you know, exploitation of his father and his people. So there are all these different interesting layers to that character, and I would really like to see more done with him because I think there's so much to explore there.
There definitely is. I think Carl Lumbly is coming back as Isaiah Bradley in the next Captain America movie. So it would be really cool to see, you know, Josiah X pop up as a character. But I think that's the interesting thing, is that you take these characters that are already rich with meaning, somebody like Captain America, and you put the costume on someone else, and it changes, you know, the perception of that character, and it changes our understanding of what the character means and what the legacy means of that character. And I remember Josiah X in The Crew being really fun character to read, a really interesting character, because his perspective was so different from everybody else. Still like an underrated gem, you know, from that time period. I think early 2000s Christopher Priest runs,
right?
Really, you know, fun, cool stuff.
It absolutely blows me away that he has not appeared anywhere since. It's just unbelievable to me, because he is such an interesting character, such a rich history there, and just like nothing's been done with him at all. And I can't fathom why nobody has gone back to that character yet.
I mean, there may be some difficulty in finding somebody that wants to write him. There's also the challenge of like figuring out where you're going to put him, where does he fit on a team, and then there's also the added thing of like, can somebody capture that voice, right?
Yeah,
it's very rare. I find that people have a hard time following up Christopher Priest, you know, on, like, I remember Reggie Hudlin's run after Priest had this like epic run on Black Panther, and it was good. It was pretty good. I don't think it was as good as Christopher Priest's run. I think he's done some stuff in DC as well that's like really top tier, and then people follow up and they're like, yeah, they're not able to pull it off. I think it would take the right kind of story to kind of bring back Josiah X. But it would be cool to see, you know, if he has a kid, or if there's somebody related to him that, you know, becomes another, you know, Captain America related character.
Yeah. It is something that it's weird. It's like, you know, 20 years now, so the character has not appeared anywhere since. I just think especially with all this new focus on diversity characters, I think, and like you said, he has such an interesting perspective. I think it would be and when they've done things like that with like United States of Captain America, where they're bringing in different characters. So I don't know if anyone from Marvel is listening, or everyone who has contacts at Marvel, please, like, you know, this is a character that's ripe for interesting possibilities to mine.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's you know, I think there's also you know, with the new movie coming out, maybe there's some more renewed interest in you know, some of these characters. I think, I don't know if you heard this, but I don't think the Truth miniseries is available anymore. I think it's out of print.
No, I think they recently they recently had a Captain America sale, and I did see it as
oh really
that. Yeah.
Oh, okay, because I thought it was out of print for a while, and
for a while the trade paperback was out of print, because I remember I think it was like maybe 2 or 3 years ago there was a Black History Month sale that Marvel was doing, and they had the Truth, and basically all the books that were part of the sale were free. And for the Truth, they didn't have a trade paperback of it; they just had the individual issues. So I remember picking up all of those. But yeah, I think they've now put it back into print. Okay,
well that's good, because it's a great book. Some incredible Kyle Baker art, really, you know, and it will change your view of Captain America, especially because it is based on some real history, specifically the Tuskegee Airmen.
Right.
So really, really powerful book, and gives you a whole new view of like what happened with Captain America and why, why that story resonates even more as like a metaphor for how things work in America.
Yeah. So I had also picked up the Ms. Marvel comics back when they first came out, and I really enjoyed them. Like, I don't say it's going to be like one of my favorite books, but I can definitely see why this book speaks to so many people. And it's an interesting, it is a fun read. I've gone and I've picked up that when the series came out, the TV show, they did release, like, they had like a big Ms. Marvel sale. So I actually picked up the whole thing. So I've got all the Ms. Marvel trades. I've got all the Champion stuff. I already had her Avengers stuff. And one of the things I really enjoy in seeing her in these other books, like when she was part of the Avengers, was seeing her interact with these characters that she's grown up idolizing. And I think that's it brings a really interesting perspective. And I think, and that actually ties in nicely to this, because right from the start, we get that with Kamala Khan, because we had a little taste of that with Peter Parker and Iron Man when he popped up. But I think it's really, a focus of Kamala's character, like how much of a fangirl she is.
Yeah.
And it adds a new spin, because when we think about a lot of these movies, I think people like us, people our age, we don't think about how long these movies have actually been around and how long these characters have existed in their world. But when you think about it, Kamala Khan is what? She's 16 years old. So she would have been a very young child by the time Iron Man appeared on the scene and by the time the Avengers appeared on the scene. So it totally, like, it always blows me away when I talk to my university students and they tell me that, like, oh yeah, I've loved the MCU movies since I was a kid. I'm like, what? How could you have loved them since you were a kid? They only started like 5 years ago.
Yeah. Time goes slower for us. Like, this happens to me all the time. I'll be like, oh, Thor: The Dark World, that came out like what, 3 years ago, and then I look and it's like, oh my god, it's 9 or 10, and just like, oh man, I'm old now. What happened?
I teach a class in Japanese film, and I gave the students a list of the films we're doing this semester, and they're all like, pretty much all of them are like, early aughts films. And then one of my students, who's like 16, he's like, wow, these are a lot of old movies on this list. I'm like, what are you talking about, old movies?
Yeah, this just came out like last year. What are you talking about? Yeah, like, aging is just like a weird time warp. Like, they just don't have the same frame of reference, and I think that's really important. I also think that part of the reason the show has, I think it's really popular with younger kids, more so than some of the older fans,
right?
And especially, it makes total sense. The opening sequence for the show is Kamala creating a YouTube video about the Avengers, which is exactly what a teenager in this day and age would do about her favorite characters, in addition to like writing fanfic and doing all that other stuff.
I was gonna say that was a nice little spin, a nice little update. Like, not that people don't write fanfic anymore, but it is a more kind of modern take on that, more of a Gen Z take on that, where it's like, well, yeah, she'd be more likely to be, making iMovies and posting them up on YouTube than she would be, typing away on a computer. And it's more visual too, to add to that. So yeah, I thought that was a really nice touch that they did to incorporate that whole fan aspect into her character.
Yeah, for sure. And it's also going to be really fun to see her interact with some of the prominent MCU characters, in the same way that when she's on the Avengers, she has some really interesting conversations with Iron Man and with Captain Marvel about what it means to be a hero. It's really different from somebody who grew up watching these characters and idolizing them, versus like, well, I'm kind of a peer, or I'm a little bit younger and I'm looking up to you, versus like, you've been around my whole life and now I get to work with you.
There's also that whole aspect of, never meet your heroes type of thing too, because that whole thing will be interesting to see how that plays out too. And it doesn't hurt as well that the actress who plays her, I want to get her name right here, Iman Vellani, I think it's pronounced. If I'm pronouncing that wrong, I'm sorry. But she is such a fangirl in real life too. Like, her enthusiasm for the MCU just like oozes out of every pore of every interview she does.
Yeah, she has deep cut knowledge of a lot of the MCU movies and things like that. And I remember I read somewhere on Twitter, people were like, yeah, she should replace Kevin Feige when he wants to retire. And I was like, that could work, I guess. She definitely could. She has that level of knowledge, but she has that energy that, and this is, one of the things that really makes the MCU work, more than visual effects or even storytelling, is they've gotten the casting right.
Yes.
Quite a bit. From Chris Evans as Captain America to Robert Downey Jr., even I would say Tatiana Maslany as She-Hulk.
Absolutely.
Yeah, she's been working real well. So they've been getting the casting right, and so much of the work is done just by that. So you really believe that Kamala is, loves the Avengers and is really excited to, be a part of it all, and is just that pumped up. So it's really exciting to see. And as kind of like long-term fans, I think it's also kind of cool to see somebody that's very much like us, that's geeking out over some of this stuff, that gets to be part of the universe.
Well, also, I think, and the casting, it always amazes me that we're now on I've lost count of how many movies we've had so far, but it's like it's in the double digits. We're in like the 20s now, and then we've got like a bunch of TV shows. And if you put a gun to my head, I don't think I could think of a single casting choice that has gone wrong. It's very hard for me to think of any casting choice like, well, that was the wrong pick. Like even character choices that I've disagreed with, I've still thought the casting was on point. Like with when we talked about Iron Man 3 and the Mandarin stuff, I still thought Ben Kingsley is an amazing choice for the Mandarin. And even for that version of the Mandarin where he's playing, like, he was still a great choice because he's got all these this whole comedic side of him I never knew Ben Kingsley had.
Yeah, I think the maybe the weakest casting choice is maybe Quicksilver from Age of Ultron.
Oh, I actually love that casting choice.
I just don't think he gets a lot to do in that movie.
That's a problem. I think that's the real problem, is he just doesn't get a lot to do. But I think if you look at what Quicksilver is in the comics, and you look at Aaron Taylor Johnson's performance, he nails it. He completely nails that character. But you're right. The biggest problem is that just he's not given a whole lot to do, and the
costume is bad. That's legitimately like one of the worst costumes that they ever gave anybody. So they didn't give him anything to do, and they gave him an outfit that looks terrible. So but I think that's important. I mean, even in the new generation of the characters now, Wyatt Russell, who plays U.S. Agent, is great casting. Florence Pugh is incredible.
She's amazing.
Yeah. So they've got
Haley Steinfeld as Hawkeye, like you mentioned before.
Yeah. Kate Bishop. Yeah, she's great. So all of these characters, I can already see the Young Avengers kind of coming out of that group. And I think the casting has a lot to do with it, and the casting has a lot to do with why this show works for me as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And also what you mentioned too about the fact that this is a show that's appealing more to young people. I remember seeing a lot of people getting angry about like, this show is too immature, it's too I'm like, not everything has to be for you. I mean, I think it's like, this show is probably not, if I had to choose any Marvel show, like you said, you can only watch one, this would probably not be the one I choose, but that's okay. Like, there's other stuff that's made specifically for me. And if this is stuff that appeals more to a younger audience, like my daughter one day, she's a little bit young right now, but if she can relate to this more than she can relate to, Hawkeye or Loki or Moon Knight, I think that's amazing. I think it's great that we're getting more variety of stuff for more people to enjoy, because I mean, I don't know about you, but when I was a kid reading comics, like, it was a very lonely experience because nobody else would even talk about reading comic books. And it was just kind of like, man, that's kind of the reason why comic fandom exploded on the internet so much, is because that was the only place a lot of us felt like we could talk about this stuff.
Absolutely. It's one of the ironies of the Marvel Cinematic Universe for me is like, when I was growing up, kid in the 80s and 90s, in high school, if you were reading comic books, like, nobody was like, oh, that's really cool, and finding t-shirts and merch and things like that, it was hard. I could get a Beta Ray Bill t-shirt from Kohl's. Like, how is that even a thing? How is that even possible? Kohl's is just like, mom and dad wear, but I can get this really nerdy T-shirt that I would have to go to a comic book store like even 20 years ago to get. So it's really interesting.
In my university, I teach at universities here in Japan. I see these cute university girls walking around wearing Marvel T-shirts. I'm like, what is happening? Like if that was happening when I was that age, my mind would have exploded in happiness.
Yeah. Like and you just didn't have that attitude wasn't there. In college, it was, I think, a little bit better because I could meet, with people that were also interested in graphic novels and things like that. But the way that it's kind of become a big part of the culture, how we talk about things is really, really important. And it's very funny to me. But, the thing is that we always knew those stories were good, that they were, appealing to people. And some of the stuff that we're seeing with She-Hulk and some of the other types of characters that are coming out, it's because the comic book companies realize like people want to see different stories, and then B, they want to see some part of themselves appear in these stories. And I think it's part of the power of the MCU right now is that you can get some reflection of yourself in the universe, and that's incredibly potent. Because like if you think about the 80s and 90s Batman, the likelihood that you were going to that we were going to get a ton of diversity in those stories just wasn't there. It was a very closed universe that looked a particular way, whereas Marvel is trying to expand not just in terms of diversity but also in terms of like tone. So, they're putting out stuff that's closer to comedy rather than just action or, tension, like a thriller or something like that. I think some of the backlash is coming from this shift in storytelling style where everything in the previous phases was all about leading up to the Infinity Gauntlet storyline. And now Marvel's kind of like being a little bit more loosey-goosey about what they're showing. They're trying to have a little bit more fun and expand the brand a little bit.
Which is something I like a lot. I like that not everything has to be leading up to it. And it actually does mirror what was happening in the early stuff. Because if you go back and you look at the Phase 1 movies, there's not a whole lot of stuff that's connecting together, right? It's just like there's lead up to the Avengers movie, but that's it. There's no like sense of a larger thing happening here. So I think it's kind of cool, especially after we've had this big lead up to Endgame. And it's just like, it's cool to just kind of like let everybody breathe for a little bit and enjoy these smaller scale stories, because not everything has to be a build up to something bigger.
Well, it's just the Wong cinematic universe now.
It is, yeah.
So I think we've all decided that Wong is the connective tissue for the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
I think so. Yeah, he's the new Nick Fury.
Yeah, there we go. Wongers forever.
Yeah. Oh God, I love that episode. Yeah. So one of the biggest controversies about this show in the lead up to it was the power change. Now, again, I don't have much of a dog in this fight. I'm not, I don't have the kind of cultural connections that other people had to the fact that the whole shape-shifting aspect and how that relates to the psychological aspect. So I've got no relation to that whatsoever. So I can't comment on any of that stuff. But just in concept, the idea of making her powers this more cosmic almost thing, I didn't have a problem with it. And I thought they had handled it really well. I thought it looked good. And I don't know, what was your take on that, the power change?
So I am a very weird fan because I'm okay with adaptations like kind of doing their own thing if it works for the film or the TV show. And I also think, generally speaking, stretchy powers look bad in movies and TV.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I don't know if you've seen any of the old scenes from like the Fantastic Four movie.
We had actually just done 2 episodes on both of those.
Okay, so the stretching powers don't look great in that.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I don't think they look that good. Even in Multiverse of Madness, even with a huge like Sam Raimi, big budget, it looked okay. But stretching powers look really weird.
Yeah.
I just think that there's something off-putting about the human body taking on these different shapes. I don't know if the CGI has gotten to a point where, if you make it too realistic, it just looks disgusting. If it's too cartoony, it looks real fake. So it's hard to like bridge that gap and find that balance. And so I think the power change makes sense. The other reason that I think the power change makes sense is it brings her closer to Captain Marvel and Photon.
Right.
And if you're telling a more connected story, then that makes sense. It also kind of reflects the weird place that Ms. Marvel was in when she came out as a character,
Mhm.
because when she came out, she was announced as an Inhuman,
Mhm.
right? And if Marvel had owned the X-Men rights, the X-Men movie rights at the time, 100% she would have been a mutant.
Oh
Like,
yeah,
there's no question.
I think G. Willow
Yeah.
Wilson actually it said that was their original intention was to make her a mutant, but then
Yeah.
editorial said no, she's got to be an Inhuman.
Yeah, and that makes total sense to me, because the central metaphor of like mutant kind works really well with being the child of immigrants and being under surveillance. So it totally it makes a lot of sense. And I think that is something that works for this character. But I did like the kind of I know people are saying that she kind of seems like Green Lantern now with the energy powers, but I think it works, and I think it looks a little bit better on screen. They did a couple things with her powers that I think deepen the character a little bit. So I love the fact that she uses her energy powers to build these pads that she can hop on like Mario.
Yeah.
Because she's supposed to be a gamer and kind of a nerd. That makes total sense, and I think that really works. The thing that I think people were upset about is one of the initial storylines. Maybe the most powerful early storyline is when she shapeshifts into Carol Danvers,
Right.
And I think there's some logistical reasons why that wasn't going to happen in this show.
Right. They weren't going to get Brie Larson to come in for this. So, I mean, you got to put things in that kind of perspective as well.
Yeah. So that storyline's not going to happen, even though I would encourage anybody who's listening to this, to this podcast, if you haven't read just the first TPB of Ms. Marvel, pick it up. That storyline is incredible because it speaks to a lot of experiences that I would say immigrant kids, minority kids kind of go through in terms of wanting to be accepted. Because the storyline, when she's trying to figure out her shape-shifting powers, she shapeshifts into what she considers on some level to be her ideal self, which is she goes from being kind of a short, dark-skinned, black-haired Pakistani girl to tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and she has to come to terms with that
white,
to kind
and
of
also,
return back. Yeah, white as well, right?
And
so,
no, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say that like she has to come to terms with that in that story in order to return to her original physical form. So there's a lot of depth there, and you get a little hint of that in the show where when she's trying on the Captain Marvel costume and it doesn't feel that comfortable to her because she's not used to wearing things that are that form-fitting. I think that's there, it's hinted at, but you do kind of miss out on that a little bit. I actually think there's probably something on the cutting room floor that's about that more, dealing with her rival Zoe. But I think because it was only 6 episodes, they couldn't cover everything that they wanted.
Yeah. That first comic book is that first graphic novel. That is such a good story, and not only does it speak a lot to that POC children of immigrants thing, but it's just like it gives you a lot of insight if you don't have those experiences either. Like just me as a white guy reading it, like it was so relatable to experiences I had as a teenager, but at the same time also giving me it does both a good job of being very relatable and also opening your eyes to this whole other perspective you may have never considered before.
Yeah. And I mean, that's what good storytelling does.
Absolutely.
That's what we hope good storytelling does. And I think it's really, really powerful to kind of be able to see that. And I think they touch upon that a couple of times in a couple of different ways in the show. Her struggle to kind of be cool, to like have friends, and especially because she wants to win this cosplay contest, and she thinks that'll make her be more popular. People will be really happy. She'll have more followers. One of the most 2022 things about this is like, oh, I need more Instagram followers so I can compete with Zoe. That's absolutely like something kids are thinking about and talking about right now.
Well, also her whole relationship with Zoe too, right? The whole thing, she's like, she wants to be liked by the most popular girl in school type of thing. There's that whole aspect of it too. And as I remember that as a teenager, like both at the same time kind of resenting the popular kids, but also wanted to be part of their group. Like, but also now being a father too. Like the scene that kills me is when her parents give her permission to go to AvengerCon, her dad comes in dressed as the Hulk, and then she's like, "This is humiliating," and then he looks so sad and despondent, and I'm just like, God, I can relate so hard to that moment because I just know that that's going to happen with my daughter one day.
Well, I think that's one of the cool things about the character, and also one of the flavors that you get in this show, and also you see this in She-Hulk, where they have families, right? They have real families. Spider-Man has a family, but it's like a family of one, right? He has Aunt May. In the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Tony has a girlfriend/wife. He has a kid at some point, but it's not as in depth and as woven into everything. But with a character like Ms. Marvel, you know that you have those moments where your parents are really trying. You know they're trying, but God damn it, this is not the right thing. This is not going to work. I'm sorry, we're not going to go together to comic book convention. And I remember having some of those conversations with my parents where I was like, hey, can you take me to this comic book convention? And they were like, this is a waste of time, this is a waste of money. Why aren't you just studying at home? That's probably better for you in your future. And I think that is extremely relatable, especially I think for a lot of the female fans of the character. And the other interesting thing about Ms. Marvel, the comic, and maybe also the TV show, though I haven't seen a lot of numbers about this. The comic book brought in a lot of new readers to the world of comics. I've met people that said that, I don't read anything except this one book that I really like. So that was one thing that I think Marvel noticed, is that there was sales happening in non-traditional locations with the character. And in fact, the character is popular enough that she shows up in a lot of other media. She's in a lot of the cartoons now, which is kind of incredible.
Yeah, they've got those. I think it's the shorts on Disney Plus. I've seen there's a lot of them about Ms. Marvel. I haven't seen all of Avengers Assemble, but I think she appears in that a few times as well in the later seasons. And you said there was there's a children's book or something with her.
There's a golden book with her in it. There's also there's also a young adult novel, like a kind of a kid's novel with her in it as well. And it's really interesting how many different places she's popping up in terms of multimedia. She's in the video games too.
Right. She's the central character of the Avengers PlayStation game. And
nuts, I
remember when they announced that, and I was being really, and I didn't realize how popular she had gotten. But now that hearing about that, it makes total sense why she would end up being the focal point of that game.
Yeah, but one of the weird things actually in the last couple of years of Marvel is they haven't put out a standalone Ms. Marvel comic over the last couple of years. Okay. Yeah, since the Saladin Ahmed run, I think I don't know what they're planning on doing with the character just yet, but she hasn't had a solo series, which is crazy. There's a writer from The Hollywood Reporter and Variety, a guy named Richard Newby. He was after the show came out, he was asking and tagging Marvel hey, you need to put out a show, a comic book series with this character. People really like her, and that's been true for many years now. She really has that Peter Parker vibe. And between the two companies, they haven't really launched many characters that have grown in popularity over the last 10 or 15 years.
There was an attempt, I remember, to have that the second Nova character, Sam, what's his name? But that character never really caught on, I don't think. They kept trying, but I don't think that character really spoke to a lot of people. But Ms. Marvel, she's really spoken to a lot of people. She's a really, she's a character that a lot of people can relate to. A lot of new readers and viewers can relate to. And that surprises me. That I thought she had still had an ongoing series at the moment. I didn't realize that they didn't have one right now.
Yeah, I don't think they have one right now at the moment. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that she's just maybe appearing in team books right now. Okay. So I would love to have, I would love to see another, series with her. But I'm glad that she's showing up in all of these other media. And I think the show does a good job of translating like what's important about the character. So I know that the power set thing, I kind of wish the powers could have stayed the same, but I appreciate what they were able to keep, which is they were able to keep some of the shape-shifting stuff with the energy, while still tying it closer to Captain Marvel and still giving her a way to kind of learn about those powers, because in those first few TPBs, that's a big part of what she's trying to do. She needs to figure out how these powers work, why they work the way that they do. I also think this hasn't been officially announced, but I'm pretty sure that the bangle that unlocks her power, I'm pretty sure it's a negaband.
Yeah,
I think
same here.
Quasar's negaband. So I don't know if they've confirmed that or not, but that's my understanding.
That was what I thought. That was where my mind first went to, which also connects it more to Captain Marvel as well. Well, also, and the connectivity. Another thing I was thinking about when I'm watching her interact with her parents, I was thinking about a lot like my parents. I'm like, her relationship with her parents was very similar to the relationship I had with my parents back then. Like it's, my mom was kind of like the more overbearing, more strict one. My dad was much more laid back, much more, kind of loosey type of thing. And just like watching her interact with them, it was bringing back so many memories of me interacting with my parents. And I thought that was also another way that shows you just like how accessible these stories are.
Yeah. I mean, I think people can relate. They might have a parent that's like a little harder on them and another one that they go to for sort of comfort. There's also, somebody mentioned this on Twitter and I can't remember who it was, but they said that I don't watch a lot of Bollywood movies, but apparently in Bollywood there's this trend of dads kind of being goofballs and kind of being silly. And so her dad definitely fits that bill. He's like whenever you see him, he's like eating sweets. He seems a little befuddled most of the time. And so I think that also kind of taps into some of those, Bollywood tropes that we don't traditionally think of. But we see some of that influence in some of the music choices and some of the set design and production design of the show as well. That there's tons of music from all sorts of different parts of the world, from the UK, from India, from Pakistan. It's really, really interesting.
Now, one of the things that I found myself like, I think that this show almost tries to do a little bit too much in the first season. I feel like if I was show running this, I think the Pakistan stuff is very interesting. It's very well done, but I think I would have liked to save that for the second season and just have the first season focused in Jersey. What about you? What were your thoughts on that?
So I was in the bag for the show. So I'm very biased in favor of the show. I really loved a lot of the I don't mind that it feels a little overstuffed. So I actually think that they probably might have thought that we don't know if we're going to get another season out of this.
I think so, yeah.
So we got to shoot our shot when we get the chance. But I think it works for the most part. It's breakneck. I think it moves very, very quickly, and there's a lot of stuff happening in it. But I think a lot of it, more of it works than doesn't.
I think so, yeah.
There's some things specifically around clandestine and kind of like asking whether or not she's a jinn or she's something else, that jinn thing actually became a big talking point in the South Asian Muslim nerd community, especially between episodes. Some people didn't really like that it felt maybe a little Orientalist. But after watching the series, and so I've kind of watched it fully like twice now, I kind of think that one of the threads in the story is about Kamala's like own identity. And so having that idea that, okay, are you, where did the superpower come from? Are you some mystical creature? Are you something else? Are you something from like the folklore of people in Pakistan, or are you something else? And then finally, the big reveal at the end of the series about what she actually is. And then her response to that, kind of saying it doesn't really matter. She, aside from those labels, she is who she is. I think that's important because, if you're growing up as a minority in the United States or any other country, part of your growth process is kind of identifying yourself and coming to terms with both your identity, like the stuff that is inherently a part of you, and the parts that you keep versus the parts that you don't. And I think that giving the show like a month or two since the last episode came out, and kind of like coming to terms with that and seeing it as a whole, as a season arc, I think it makes a little bit more sense. And I think that's why they have, this journey to Pakistan, because that's also something that she kind of comes to terms with for herself. They actually adapted a wide range of the comics as well, because she does go to Pakistan in the Ms. Marvel comics. She has the storyline there with the Red Dagger. She has a whole there's a whole series of storylines there, and it's a lot. They cover an enormous amount in just these 6 episodes. I gladly would have watched an additional 2 episodes. Marvel, if you want to give us more episodes, we'd be happy to watch.
I think they've already announced a second season, haven't they?
That's the rumor. That's the rumor, but I haven't seen it confirmed anywhere that I actually trust.
Okay. That's a fair point then. I had heard about a second season, so I just assumed that it was already greenlit then. But yeah, that was my biggest thing. And it's not, and again, it's not saying that Pakistan stuff is bad by any means. I thought it was really interesting. It was really cool to see them shoot. I think they actually shot in Pakistan, didn't they?
I believe it was Thailand.
Oh, Thailand. Okay.
Yeah, I think Pakistan presents some interesting logistical problems.
I was wondering about that. Yeah. But just like being able to show that other side and like delve into that kind of aspect of her character, and then going into the history of it with the partition, because like we'd mentioned earlier when we were talking about that podcast, partition's not something that even people of Pakistani descent really know a lot about, because it's something that one of the things they talk about in the podcast is how a lot of people who have gone through partition, they don't really want to talk about what their experiences were like back then because it was so traumatic, and which is understandable. But up until that, the only thing I had ever heard of partition up until Ms. Marvel was the scenes in the movie Gandhi about partition. And that was about it. And I know nothing else about it, really.
Yeah, there's actually a long history of and it's funny we're talking about this like right after Queen Elizabeth passes, but the British did a lot of really negative things in South Asia. Yeah. So by some estimates, to say the least, by some estimates, they had taken $45 trillion worth of wealth out of India. They Winston Churchill at least starved out parts of the Bay of Bengal, parts of what we would call modern day Bangladesh, killing somewhere in the range of 6 to 10 million people over a period of years. If you ever see the movie Lagan, which is an Indian movie about British colonies kind of demanding higher taxes of the Indian community. That's a very fun movie, but it's about like a really tough subject. There's a lot of stuff that happened during that time. And then if you read a little bit about partition was really haphazardly done. Like they sent somebody, I believe somebody named Radcliffe to India. He basically decides, like kind of on a whim, here's where the borders are, and then people have to just go. And I think it's still considered the largest human migration in human history and to have happened as quickly as it did. And so people lost family members, people lost, property, legacies. There are a lot of people in modern day Pakistan now who still have roots in other parts of India. And there are people that went to India from other parts of, what is now Bangladesh and Pakistan that have roots in those places. And it's all because of the fear of kind of sectarian violence when the country was split. So it was really, very poor diplomacy and very bad thinking around this. I think it's really interesting to see it show up in a comic book story, but I think it also kind of has this sort of thematic echoing to what the villains of the show were trying to do, right? They were outside of their traditional homes, and they were trying to get through their own partition to go back,
right?
And there's always this sense of people in the modern era of South Asia kind of building a new identity and a new sense of self out of the rubble of partition.
You should definitely check out that podcast because they did a whole episode about
Mhm.
that kind of haphazard partitioning, and
Mhm.
they'd also done 2 episodes about the experiences of specifically about women going through all that.
Mhm.
So it's a really good listen. I think it's still ongoing. So by the time this episode comes out, it should be all completed though.
Oh, cool.
I believe so. But yeah, it's and well, also the fact that they're doing this through a comic book show, it also echoes what Watchmen did with the Tulsa riots, right?
Mhm.
And just kind of like, and it's so interesting to see these things brought to light and brought to more awareness brought to them through these things. Because actually, when I think about it, that's how I learned a lot about the Holocaust was because the X-Men talked about it so much,
Mhm.
and otherwise, like the civil rights movement too, to a lesser extent, was because it was such a big focus of those
Mhm.
comics I read when I was growing up. Whereas in history class, it was just kind of like we're going to spend a little bit of time on this, but not going to talk
Mhm.
too much about it. And with stuff like Tulsa or partition, like this is stuff I had never known about.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean it's really interesting because the narratives that get told are told by, whoever's in power, and people don't want to talk about, something like Tulsa, which is like a real expression of white supremacist power.
Right.
And frankly a really terrible story overall. People don't necessarily want to remember that, but it's important for us to kind of recall these types of things, and that's why I'm glad that if the show started a conversation about partition amongst people who never thought about it, if they picked up a book or listened to a podcast about it because of the show, I think that's the power of including some real life elements in these, kind of goofy comic book type shows and movies.
Yeah, absolutely. So you made an interesting point about the clandestine here and their desire to kind of overcome. I had not realized that as I was watching it, but it does make a whole lot more sense, and that's a whole new spin because the clandestine stuff to me was, to be honest, it was kind of like the least interesting thing about it. The show for me was all the stuff involving them. I was so much more invested in Kamala and her experiences becoming a hero and her experiences in Jersey, which is also why, as much as I like the Pakistan stuff, I did wish it was in its own separate season so that we could have had, because I feel like this story really kind of fired on all cylinders when it was in the Jersey setting.
Yeah, I think the thing about so this is a common thing about Ms. Marvel. I don't know if you noticed this in reading some of the comics, but her villain roster is not particularly strong.
Well, in that first graphic novel, she doesn't really have a villain as far as
No, her villain is like herself figuring out what she wants to do.
Right.
And then there's the inventor who's this like part cockatoo type character that's kidnapping teens. It very much feels a little bit like Scooby-Doo a bit, not in a bad way, but in a way where it's like, yeah, this is very much teenager type stuff. Later on she has I will say that Ms. Marvel comics are very on the nose with regards to their metaphors, because they had another character that was like working with Dr. Faustus and Hydra that was trying to take over Jersey City. There's like a character called Detention that's basically like an authoritarian. I mean, they're not like they're not being subtle about any of the metaphors that they're talking about in the comics, but the villains are without a doubt the weakest part of the comics, especially even like it was more fun when she teams up with Wolverine. You didn't even need a villain, you just wanted them to hang out,
right? Yeah.
And
I remember that being one of my favorite issues was her interacting with Wolverine.
Absolutely. And it's just like it's exactly like the kind of fangirl that you would expect to just hang out with Wolverine, take a selfie with him, ask him all these questions, and then still get a lesson from the character. So I think they make that very, very explicit. But I do, I love like her friends. I like her chemistry with Bruno. I like the fact that they spend some time with her best friend Nakia. I think it's great to see her relationship with her brother, with her parents, and I mean the wedding episode is so much fun, right? To kind of just see her do that. But it's also very much a Peter Parker moment where she's got to pull the fire alarm and ruin her brother's wedding, right? So the clandestine also, and this goes back to a time thing, it's very unclear what their actual powers are. right? Like, what is their power set? Like, are they super strong? Are they super fast? What weaponry are they using? It's very, very unclear what they're capable of. And even her like semi love interest, Kamran, we're not really sure what his powers are either, and what the relationship is between him and like the rest of the clandestine. I do think it's kind of a funny way to reappropriate the Alan Davis comic book. I don't know if you ever read.
I was thinking about because now I've never read them other than like I know they had a crossover with X-Men at one point, and I read that, but that's like my only experience with the clandestine. So I thought that's where I thought I'm like, this is such a weird choice to pick, like such a weird deep cut. And it's clear they're just like, and they did the same thing that which funny enough, when we talked about Moon Knight, it was the same situation in Moon Knight, where the character they pick for the villain is just this obscure name they take out and they pluck on this character. I feel like they did the same thing with the clandestine here.
I think they chose the clandestine because the clandestine are supposed to be Jinn. Actually, the original characters are supposed to be, it's a British, I forget the main character from Clandestine, but he falls in love with a Jinn. They have some children. Those children then have powers, and so that's very explicit. I can see that as an explicit choice that's been made by the producers of Ms. Marvel to kind of say, well, there are Jinn characters in the MCU. We're going to use them for for Ms. Marvel, but they're also not the driving engine of the story necessarily. It's mostly again about her like self-discovery.
Yeah. So I'm just looking up about them. So yeah, he has this ends up getting up with an angel. I'm not sure if it's a Jinn specifically. I'd have to read more into that. Might mention that somewhere in here. But yeah, and they're like this very long-lived group of characters. And it's also interesting that they've taken this idea of how they're Jinn in the comics, but they're all a bunch of white people from England. And then they take that and they give it to people of Southeast Asian descent in this one instead.
Yeah,
so that was a nice little change, I thought.
Yeah, there's actually there's much more diversity in the group because there's an African American
that's
person.
Right.
Yeah, and there's a couple of South Asians, and but the reason for that was because in the clandestine comics, that character he's British and he's just with a Jinn, and then he stays in Britain, and his descendants continue to have superpowers because of that original relationship. There's actually a little genealogy chart that you can find online of the clandestine that shows you like where it started and where they ended up.
Yeah,
it's Alan Davis who's usually pretty good, but the comic book's not great. It's only really it's okay. Marvel, if you want to give me a shot at rewriting, clandestine, just give me a call.
Yeah, I remember because I remember reading their X-Men crossover. The thing about Alan Davis is I love his artwork, but the stuff I've read that he's written hasn't been as interesting to me. Like he did a run on X-Men that didn't really do much for me, and the clandestine thing he wrote with the clandestine X-Men crossover, I just kind of like breeze through that when I was reading it in one of the Epic collections because it just it didn't really do a whole lot for me. I'd like the characters never really seemed very interesting to me at all. So yeah, when they mentioned clandestine in the show, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember those guys, and then that was like the extent of my interest in it.
Yeah, and I do think that they're mostly there to kind of get Kamala to confront her past and how she feels about her family, and not really understanding where she comes from, or and it's also really important in the show. There's a thing in South Asian culture where you don't talk about painful things or shameful things from your past, and so her grandmother, her great grandmother, is treated as like one of those shameful secrets. And one of the funny things is she doesn't really do much. She just disappears for no real reason. Nobody understands why, and that becomes something of a shameful secret for her family, and it becomes an issue for Kamala because it stops her from really knowing and understanding where her family comes from. And that happens sometimes. Like there are things that during early 20th century that might be considered shameful or too painful to discuss that we would talk about in modern era. For example, my grandmother, she lost my grandfather very early on when my dad was only 4. She never talked about my grandfather ever. Because it was not necessarily because she was ashamed, but she felt it was too painful and she didn't want to dwell on it. So there is that part of the culture that's kind of reflected in the show.
That explains so much about the partition thing, and just like, because when I'm listening to this podcast about partition and they're talking about how so many people, their families, and they're growing up, they're like, we don't want to talk about that. We don't want to talk about that. And it's such a interesting contrast to when you think about the Holocaust, where it's, those people are constantly encouraged to share their stories and to talk about what they went through in the camps and all that. And it's this interesting cultural difference, but also I think part of it is cultural. I think there's also there's probably a not so subtle racism aspect of it as well, where it's like, we want to hear about the hard things that white people have gone through, but we don't want to hear about the hard things that brown people have gone through.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think there's also one of the key differences with the Holocaust as well is there's a lot more video documentation of what happened, right? And so once you can see it, it's hard to turn away.
Right.
And then there's also a question of are there people, especially in the Western world, ready to listen to what happened in India when, a Western power ostensibly is the cause of all this suffering. The people in power, they may not want those stories to be told or discussed. And there's also a lot of, chaos that happens leading up to, Indian independence and Pakistani and Bangladeshi independence. A lot of turmoil during this time. So there may not be as much of an opportunity to kind of collect a lot of those stories as well. Whereas, I would say the Jewish diaspora, they've done a very good job of kind of collecting those stories and documenting what happened during that time.
I think also the fact that the Nazis were so bureaucratic and they kept so many records of stuff also definitely helped that as well. And also, I was not expecting this, U.S. and the Holocaust documentary to so connect to what we're talking about here, but it does, because there's this whole thing they talk about how people at the state. There were so many people at the State Department in the U.S. at the time who were so anti-Semitic and so xenophobic that they just kept trying to deny any evidence that the Holocaust was happening until that evidence became too powerful to ignore. And so I think you're right. I think that's a very good point, is because of all the documentary evidence that came out about it as well, it made it a lot harder to deny it as also. And yeah, you're right. And it's the same thing with Tulsa too. There's not as much documentary evidence as there was with that too. But so yeah, that's another aspect of it that definitely plays into it. And you see it a lot in these. We're finding out more. I shouldn't say because a lot of people who are from those communities, they've known about this stuff for all this time. But I mean, like people like me, like white people, when we're finding about this stuff for the first time, like stuff about. One of the most powerful things I've seen in recent years was the HBO documentary series Exterminate All the Brutes, which is all about like the colonial stuff, like all over the world that was going on, and just like shining this, uncompromising light on this, brutal practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that it's interesting. We talk about villains and heroes very often in when we're talking about superhero media, and sometimes like when you get to see real life villainy, real life evil kind of come to the forefront, it puts those things into perspective. I think that's been helpful in terms of like my comic book reading, is understanding some of that history. And it has led me to, kind of investigate certain things a little bit more. You're right. I wonder how many kids growing up reading X-Men comics then had to think about, well, I guess I'm going to read a little bit more about the Holocaust because Magneto went through it. So I need to understand a little bit more about it. So I think those are really powerful, and hopefully people can start to understand a little bit more about the experiences of South Asians from partition.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Something else I wanted to mention along those lines. I'm blanking on it now, but I'm sure it'll come to me later. I did want to talk a little bit about, I thought Damage Control was a weird choice to use as like these government antagonists, because Damage Control in the comics, they're just the cleanup guys, right? They just come in after the battle and they just clean stuff up. And I thought it's really weird to use them instead of all these other organizations that exist in the comics that seem would be much better fit for that kind of role.
So I think they're changing Damage Control from so this is my like weird theorizing. So if anybody thinks this is like a kooky idea, but I think that they're setting Damage Control up almost because we know that the X-Men are coming.
Right.
I think Damage Control is getting set up as the folks that are going to build Sentinels.
I think so too. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think they're setting it up because Damage Control in the comics is like very comedy oriented. I remember the Damage Control comic is like kind of silly. Oh, all this stuff got destroyed. How are we gonna fix it now? But in the show, they're much more authoritarian. They're much more kind of semi-fascist. I mean, they make some really explicit. They show some explicit, kind of connections to potential fascist views because I mean they walk into the mosque and they're wearing shoes. They don't have any respect for anybody in the community. They're just kind of like, no, we're gonna we need to be able to find out who in your community is super powered. And I think this is part of the reason they announced her or they made her a mutant in this series is I think Damage Control is going in that direction, and I think they need a replacement for Shield that isn't Sword and that isn't say what is the other one in space?
That Sword is the one in space, but I think you're thinking of, I think you're thinking of Hammer. That was the
maybe him, yeah, maybe
Norman Osborn's
maybe
one.
Hammer. Yeah, so they're coming out with the other, with these other groups, but I think they're saving them as being more heroic, and they're going to kind of say like Damage Control are the bad guys that are trying to catch all the mutants.
See, Sword makes more sense because they were always more or less pretty heroic in the comics. But I did think the fact that you mentioned that now made me think that's exactly what I was thinking when I watched this show. I'm like, why are they using Damage Control instead of Hammer? That seems like a more logical choice. Because obviously, if you use the MRD from the X-Men Evolution, or not, I think it was Wolverine and the X-Men, that card animated series. Use the MR Mutant Response Division. Well, people are going to know right away that and then the big twist at the end that she's a mutant is going to be dead right away. So I understand them not using that, but like I think Hammer would have made a little bit more sense for me. And maybe it's just me just holding out hope to see like a Damage Control sitcom or something like that. Would be really fun.
Well, they had a DC version of that a few years ago with Vanessa Hudgens. She was in a show that was kind of like Damage Control,
right? And like Alan Tudyk was in that too, wasn't he? I believe.
Yeah, he was in it as well. I think it was only on for one season. It wasn't bad. But,
I never saw it. It never popped up on any of the streaming stuff. So
it might be on Peacock now, but I'm not sure where it would be. But
I can't even remember the name of it. Do you remember the name of it?
I don't. I have to check Vanessa Hudgens IMDb I'll look
it up after then. But yeah, that was something I remember a lot of people being very angry about that when it was announced. I'm like, it's fine. We can have a sitcom set in the superhero universe.
Yeah.
But yeah, so, Hammer I thought would have made a much more logical sense, but they did need something here. And I think the whole mutant thing, it does also it fits so much better, like you were saying, for Kamala's character, for her to be a mutant, because the whole thing about the Inhumans, it's like they're descended from this ancient race of like royals and all that kind of stuff, and it loses some of that everyman aspect that being a mutant has, I think.
Yeah, I also think the Inhumans are harder. They're just a harder sell. They also didn't have like a particularly good TV show adaptation. No. I saw some parts of it. It wasn't great.
It was not. It was not.
Yeah, like so I think they want to kind of and the only reason they were focusing on the Inhumans so much was because they didn't have the X-Men. So now they have got the X-Men. I think they want to kind of tie Ms. Marvel closer to that particular part of the universe, especially because
mostly that was just Ike Perlmutter's whole bugaboo, because he was in charge of when he was running Marvel Studios, he was very big on, we can't use the X-Men, so the Inhumans are now our X-Men. So he pushed them really hard in the comics, and then he was gonna push them in the movies. Disney undercut him, and they gave Kevin Feige Marvel Studios can run on his own, but he still had the TV division, which is why we had the Inhumans so heavily featured in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and why they got their own TV show. And then now that Feige's got control of everything and he's got the mutants, now we start to see them rolled out in a much more organic fashion.
Yeah, I think that'll play out with her character, and I think they have because Iman Vellani is such a good fit for this character, and she's such like an audience surrogate in addition to just being a fun hero. I think you're going to see her pop up in a lot of things. I think they're really banking on the Marvels with Captain Marvel and Photon and her. I think they expect it to do well, and I think it'll be a fun movie.
I think watching She-Hulk lately, it made me think that because She-Hulk is very episodic, right? It's just like these little kind of like different stories that connect to her superhero life. That kind of makes me think I kind of wish that was what we saw more of with Ms. Marvel, because it is at its best when it's focused on those character moments, those character interactions, the difficulty she has balancing the superpowers and her civilian identity, trying to discover who she is. And I kind of wish that instead of getting this 6-episode arc about the clandestine and the Jinn and all this stuff, that we had just gotten 6 episodes about her going through life in Pakistan as a superpowered teenager.
Oh yeah. I mean, that would have been interesting to see. I think the things that I really enjoyed in the show, I really loved kind of the depiction of just like everyday American Muslim life. I thought that was really cool. I thought it was really cool to see Pakistan in a different light, just seeing people living every day. And it was also really funny to see like her family in Pakistan is very wealthy. So and you can tell because they've got a huge house. This is, sometimes if you go back to, the old country, you might see that your family has a ton of money. They've got a big place. Which is kind of contrasted to some of the poverty that you might see in places like Pakistan and India and Bangladesh, because there's a huge income disparity in those countries. So I kind of like the fact that we got to see a lot of those things. One thing we didn't get a chance, we haven't talked about in the show, one of my favorite parts of the show is that Ms. Marvel is like the most visually, kind of interesting Marvel TV show, I think, because they did so many little things, with the text messaging, with her doing the little dance number when she first meets Kamran. I really felt like they did a lot of fun things with the show and kind of made it a little more of a flavor than your typical kind of superhero show. So I think that was stuff that really was exciting and fun, and I think they did a great job like curating really interesting music, taking the character to some really interesting places and having some conversations and showing things that you don't usually see. Like I never thought we would see like a big South Asian wedding in a superhero show of any kind, and to have that happen in Ms. Marvel was a lot of fun. To have her, have her like save her first person at a mosque was really funny. I was like, oh, this is really, kind of cool. So you got a chance to kind of split the difference between seeing superhero life and kind of her, very unique life in New Jersey and then later in Pakistan as well.
Yeah, and those were the things that really got me interested the most. Like as soon as we got into clandestine and to a lesser extent damage control, those are the times when I started checking out a little bit more of the series. But anytime we were in Jersey, we were dealing with her struggles with her identity, with her life with her family, contrasting that with her life with her classmates and all that kind of stuff. I'm just like, man, I love all this stuff. I want to see more of this stuff.
Well, hopefully we get a second season so we can see, more of that, because the storyline with her family in the comics is really interesting. Seeing what happens with her brother and his wife, with Amr and his wife is really interesting because they have a kid, and there's a bunch of really fun ways where the story could go.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, also you mentioned about the color too. I think the power change actually helps work towards that too, because I can't imagine those stretchy powers really kind of fitting in as well to the kind of colorful, the way they use colors and imagery in this show. with those stretchy powers. Having those bright color effects, I think it really helps enhance that as well.
Yeah, for sure. The color palette for the show is really different, I think, than most of the stuff we see in Marvel, and I think that makes it makes it really cool. You see that in her costuming as well, like the costume design, the way it changes over the course of the series is really cool and kind of reflects her, the identity that she ends up building. Right, she gets pieces of the costume from everybody that's important in her life, and that's so. It's funny, we people joke about like these prequel stories, like going into details about where Indiana Jones got his fedora and all of that stuff, and you're like, oh, I don't really want to know that. But this was cool. It was kind of like really building the character up from the from the ground level to another level.
I think more than any other character I can really think of is that reminded me the most of like Superman getting his costume, right? The whole idea, the whole, I like your costume. Thanks. My mom made it for me type of thing. Or like the fact that his Earth mom made it from the blankets that he was sent to Earth in by his parents. And I think all of that, it feels very similar to the way Kamala gets her costume put together.
Yeah, definitely. Like she, it's so funny that Ms. Marvel as a character is so different in terms of like demographics, but she echoes so much of classic Peter Parker, classic Clark Kent. You can see those, especially if you've read a lot of comics or seen a lot of comic book movies. You can see those echoes in this character. It's very clear.
Right. Yeah, and I think some of that was probably definitely intentional when G. Willow Wilson was crafting the character to intentionally make it so that this character is more relatable to a large audience. It has that kind of familiarity.
Yeah, for sure. Even Adrian Alfono's art in the comic and in the G. Willow Wilson run does a really good job of making the character seem more human than what we see in other characters, and you see that when she pops up in some of the other comics, you can see what a big difference it is in how she's depicted versus in her main title, where she does seem like, oh, she's a little short, and she doesn't seem like she's that athletic, and that's okay. I think that's also something that we see with amusingly with Iman Vellani. She's not very tall, and they don't do anything to hide that she's not very tall. It's just part of her character. It's right. Like,
yeah, that was something that really stood out. You just reminded me, that was something that really stood out when I was reading that first comic, is the fact that she looks like a normal teenager. She doesn't look like I remember reading Witchblade, and seeing like Michael Turner drawing like these teenager characters who have like massive breasts and long legs. They're just like, that's not really what teenagers look like. But Kamala is drawn like a real teenager, and I thought that was a really nice aspect to that book. And yeah, Iman Vellani, she's very much a teenage girl. They're not trying to hide they're not trying to hide the height thing at all. Like, she looks just like a normal kid. Okay, I think, is there anything else you wanted to mention about Ms. Marvel?
Just a couple of things that I think are important. I think what a lot of the Muslim community like embraced the show because it's really fun, and it's really cool to see a character like her in in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's going to be fun to see her in other movies and other TV shows. And I think the coolest thing about the show is just how much character you get, not just from her, but from all the characters. But we didn't even talk about, like, there's a lot that's going on with Bruno. Everybody has like stuff going on,
right?
And I think it really does capture a lot of that early kind of Spider-Man, Peter Parker vibe of, oh, this is like a person who just happened to get these powers and is kind of like working through the experiences there. And I really think it's one of my favorites. I recognize so much of my own community in the show, and it's really, really fun to kind of see that and to be able to kind of say, oh, okay, I get this reference. I understand. Like, she has this conversation about Bollywood movies. I'm not the biggest Bollywood fan, but I know the movies that she's referencing. My wife recognizes a ton of the songs that are in the background, and I think it opened up the world of Marvel to a number of people that probably wouldn't have thought about Marvel as a place where they could see stories of themselves. And I hope that continues. I know there's been some pushback about, She-Hulk and some of the other shows that are going to come out. but I really think there's a lot of value in this story and in this show. And I see myself rewatching this, with my son and, maybe with some other family members, and really sharing it as kind of a fun celebration of, our place in kind of the American diaspora.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I was thinking that too. Like, when my kids get older, this is definitely something I want them to see. Like, this might be one of their first ways to get into the MCU is through something like this. And as for the negative reaction, I think most of that is it's just very loud trolls. And I think Marvel smartly knows not to listen to them, because they've proven so far that they're not really paying attention. Like, that all really kind of started with Captain Marvel when that came out. And instead of getting cold feet on anything, Marvel almost seems to be doubling down. So I think they're definitely, and they're smart enough to know what kind of response they're getting from real people, as opposed to just like, a bunch of loud trolls and sock puppet accounts.
Yeah, I think that's one thing to really to pay close attention to. Is part of the reason Marvel has become so popular is because it's not just boys that are watching these shows. It's not just it's young ladies. It's pretty much everybody who's interested in kind of having a fun time with superheroes. They can watch these shows and they can enjoy them. So I think it's really, that speaks to the power of these original stories and what a broad appeal they can actually have.
Well, I mean, I think, and Marvel's always kind of been like that. They've always been kind of like on the cutting edge of, the cultural boundaries, even back in the 60s. I mean, we look at some of those stories now and they're kind of cringy. They don't age well, but at the time they were very progressive.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, we sometimes forget that because those stories have now become kind of like old hat, but they're still, for the time period, they are very cutting edge, and this is part of what makes the brand really strong and popular.
Right, absolutely, yeah. Okay, Sai, thanks so much for coming on again. Do you want to tell people where they can find you?
Sure, you can find me on Twitter at io Sai Islam. You can find our book, Leaders Assemble Leadership in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, on Amazon. You can go to tinyurl.com/Amazon MCU and it'll take you right there. And you can always reach out to me on Twitter is probably the best place to find me. And I love talking about this stuff, love talking about leadership and Marvel Comics and DC too, if you really want to. I'm a Zack Snyder defender, so that's my dirty secret. So feel free to reach out to me, and you can tweet at me about that if you want.
Well, we won't hold it against you. No. They're like I've as long as you're not an asshole about it, which you're not. Anthony Desiato, who's been on a few episodes now, he's not either. So as long as you're not an asshole about it, I've got no problem with you. I disagree completely about it, but don't understand it. But you do you type of thing.
Yeah, I'm not invested in getting anything restored. So I got a kid at home. I got other things I got to do.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. But thanks again for coming on. You're always welcome back. And all those links and stuff will be in the show notes if you couldn't quite catch them. So you can just go click on them as well. But that does it for this episode of Superhero Cinephiles. SuperheroCinephiles.com is the website. Super Cinema Pod on Twitter and Instagram. And remember, if you subscribe to the Patreon, you get these episodes a week in advance, and you also get access to the Superhero Cinephiles Book Club companion podcast, where we talk about comics, graphic novels, all that fun stuff. Thanks so much for listening, and we will talk to you next time. If you enjoyed the Superhero Cinephiles, then you'll also love my companion podcast, the Superhero Cinephiles Book Club. All my Patreon subscribers get access to this exclusive podcast where I review superhero comics and graphic novels. Not sure what comics you want to read next or what you should dive into? I've got you covered on that. I'll be doing reviews, recommendations, and also talking to you about useful entry points if you're interested in reading some comics but don't know where you should start. Plus, you'll get access to all episodes of the main show a week before everyone else. On all of this for as little as just $1 a month. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/supercinemapod and you can sign up at any subscription amount to get started. Thanks so much for your support, and please don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you for listening. And as always, good night, good evening. God bless.